Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. In previous episodes of Brave New World with Sinan Aral, Jonathan Haidt, and Helena Rosenblatt, I discussed some of the unintended side effects of social media platforms on various sections of society, such as their impacts on political polarization and mental health. My guest today is Chris Bail, professor of sociology and public policy at Duke University, and the author of a book called Breaking the Social Media Prism. Chris's position on the causes of political polarization reminds me of one of my favorite Shakespearean quotes from Julius Caesar. "The fault lies not in our platforms, dear Brutus, but within ourselves." Okay, Cassius said stars, not platforms, but that was the 16th century. Chris explains how platforms are the tool we use to understand ourselves and each other in our quest for things like status. Why are some of the politest people in the real world so vile online, especially when they know fully well that they are not going to change anyone's minds? Why are people's online and offline behaviors so different? Have social media platforms lost their purpose? What would it take to create better platforms with incentives that facilitate true dialogue on key social issues that are critical to a healthy democracy? I really enjoyed reading Chris's book. His positions are grounded in real data, and reading it made me realize how little we actually know about political polarization and how we could go about learning more about ourselves and how to think about designing better social media platforms for the brave new world ahead of us. Chris, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Chris, your work is about polarization, and we've certainly seen a lot of polarization occur in the United States in the last couple of years. And the COVID crisis seems to have just sort of deepened that, and which was, I guess, too bad in a sense, because a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. What we're seeing now is this invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And there was an interesting article by Tom Friedman in the Times, and I'll just quote a snippet from that article. And he says, "This is the first war that will be covered on TikTok by super-empowered individuals armed only with smartphones. So acts of brutality will be documented and broadcast worldwide without any editors or filters." Do you think we'll see more unity on social media this time around because of this invasion of Ukraine?
I wish I could say yes, but unfortunately, I'm a little pessimistic. 5 years ago, I think if someone told me that we would have a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic and we would be brought to the brink of, possible nuclear war with Russia, that these two things alone should be able to, encourage us to set aside our differences. But, for about the last 10 years in the United States, outgroup animosity has been significantly higher than, love for one's own political side. And that's a really concerning situation because, people are really not able to put the country's, best interest first in line. And the typical dynamics that we see, for example, ancient ideas like the enemy of my enemy is my friend no longer apply.
Well, that's a pretty depressing scenario.
Sorry,
I would have thought that everyone would be damning Putin from across all ends of the political spectrum.
Well, 2021
so that's a little discouraging.
Yeah, 2021 taught me not to be too optimistic about 2022. So we'll see. In the long term, I am optimistic, but in the short term, I'm worried we're going to see more of the same.
So let's talk about the short term first, right? So you open your book with this notion of an echo chamber. There was one sentence there that caught my eye, which is that a lot of people see social media as a refuge. That's interesting. I hadn't actually thought about that. So can you just sort of amplify that, what you mean by that and what you're seeing in this echo chamber and why it exists in the first place?
Sure. Well, way back in 2017, 2016, I think a lot of us were surprised by high profile events like, the somewhat surprising election of Donald Trump, the Brexit referendum in Britain. These seem to be things that were not predictable. And, at the time, a lot of the conversation was moving to social media. And I think a lot of us thought, well, this idea of an echo chamber explains how we could be so easily surprised by these kinds of events, right? If we only follow people who are on our side and only listen to people who are on our side, then, it makes sense that we could be surprised when there's, say, palpable excitement for a candidate like Trump on the right, if you're a Democrat, or if you are, pro-EU, you might not have seen the real charisma created by, the leaders of the anti-Brexit movement. So the idea that we are trapped inside echo chambers on the face of it, that we are, only able to, listen to our own side and proactively try to limit our exposure to the other side, and really that social media encourages us to do that and allows us to do that, has a lot of face appeal.
But so, okay, let's take that deeper, right? Because we've got these two sides, right? And each of them with fervent beliefs. Surely we shouldn't have been surprised that there were these two sides, right? I mean, is there more to this going on? Is it the fact that media tends to be sort of liberal and therefore just ignored the conservatives as sort of just wrote them off as extreme fringe cases as opposed to something more mainstream?
Well, certainly the idea of echo chambers has been around for a long time. So we could go all the way back to the 1980s and talk about the rise of cable news. And throughout the 1990s, various social scientists were discovering that, sure enough, liberals were listening to CNN or watching CNN and conservatives were watching Fox News. And it seems that, the prevailing narrative in those stations tended to shape public opinion about things like the Iraq War or the Clinton administration or various events, up to the current moment. So certainly, mainstream media still plays a role. But I think the thing that concerned a lot of people when social media, first became so widely adopted is that, we can proactively ignore other people. And indeed, many people like the internet activist Eli Paris are worried that algorithms in the kind of, people you may know algorithms that we all see when we log into social media might be encouraging those human tendencies to surround ourselves with like-minded people.
So what's the problem here? You make a statement that the problem lies deep within ourselves, maybe as much as social media, or maybe even more than social media, right? That maybe, one of my sort of really crisp takeaways from your book was that, maybe we're just using these social media platforms as tools to sort of amplify our own dark tendencies, and that the problem lies deep within ourselves, which was an interesting take for me because I tend to sort of focus on social media platforms myself as being a major culprit here. Whereas you're saying, not so fast. Let's take a deeper look at ourselves first. So what's going on here? What's wrong with us?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I wish I could tell you that after doing a decade of research in this area, that we could simply kind of waltz into Facebook's source code, tweak a few lines and turn down the, the volume of outrage and polarization on our platforms. But what I've learned in doing the science of this is that, I was wrong and a lot of us were wrong about the common explanations about what drives polarization. So let's start maybe with the echo chamber. Again, I was alongside many people thought this is the way we should proceed. We need to get people out of echo chambers and then we could drive down polarization. And so in 2018, I founded the Duke Polarization Lab, which is an interdisciplinary team of social scientists, computer scientists, and data scientists who try to both do research on polarization on social media, but also to develop new technology to help fight back. And so one of the very first things we thought we should do is try taking people out of their echo chambers, right? If only liberals could listen to conservatives for a little while and conservatives could listen to liberals for a little while, a lot of people are saying, and not just anyone, but Twitter's CEO Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg famously argued, also that echo chambers were a big part of the problem here. That if we could take people out of these echo chambers, then they could start to see that there's two sides to every story, or even maybe empathize with the other side a little bit more. And so what we did in 2017 was we recruited about 1,220 Republicans and Democrats, and we asked them to take a survey about their views. We asked them all sorts of questions about a bunch of different issues: climate change, racial discrimination, size of government, try to place them on a liberal to conservative continuum. And then 1 week later, we randomized half of them into a treatment condition, a large experiment, where they were offered about $26 or up to $26 to follow a bot that they were told would tweet 24 times a day. Now, we didn't tell the people what the bots would tweet, but eventually they began to tweet 24 messages a day from politicians, journalists, media organizations, and advocacy groups from the other side. So if you're a Republican, you saw Democrats 24 times a day. And if you were a Democrat, you saw Republicans 24 times a day. And we hoped that this experiment would moderate people, that, again, these people who were following the other side for 1 month would begin to see that there's two sides to every story and begin to maybe, humanize the other side a little bit more.
And what did you find?
Unfortunately, we found exactly the opposite. So not only did we find that most people weren't moderating their views, we found that a lot of people, and particularly Republicans, were actually doubling down in their original views. So when we paid Republicans to follow Democrats for a month, they actually became more conservative, and substantially more conservative. Democrats became more liberal too, though the size of the effect was not as large, and it wasn't statistically significant. So we can say, though, that what everybody thought would happen, right, what Mark Zuckerberg and so many politicians and others have argued, that if we just stepped outside our echo chamber, it would fix the problem, doesn't seem like it's that easy.
That's interesting. And I want you to say a little bit more about your method. One of the points you raise is that people do, so to say, controlled experiments, but then you don't know what they'll be like when they go back to their natural environment. You may see an effect in the lab, and people go back to their natural environments, and then the effect disappears. And I guess that motivated you to do a field study where you're actually talking to people and following them. So say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's a big problem we have, social scientists like us, right? We get people in a lab and we show them something, or we have some kind of treatment that we do in the context of 15 minutes maybe. And then we make huge extrapolations from what we find in these kind of tiny changes in behavior that we often observe to the rest of their lives. And, often even worse, we do this with college students, right? So we can't even generalize to beyond college students. And that's a huge problem. Why? Well, let's take our current example. Maybe an ideal experiment would be to lock people in a room for a month and only show them news from the other side, right? I don't think many people would sign up for that, and obviously would be probably logistically impossible and most importantly unethical. But we wanted to kind of do the next best thing. If we only show people a few messages over, say, a few minutes, we can't know that, that's enough treatment to change their minds, right? It could be that, when I see a few messages, I think, oh, yeah, that side's maybe got a few points. But then later that day, I see, a barrage of messages from my own side, and it simply counterbalances all the effects of the treatment. So we wanted to give people like a really heavy dose of the treatment, but also in a real life setting. We wanted to see them sharing the information, or see whether they would share the information on their networks, or see how it factored into their everyday lives. We wanted to go beyond what we could see in simple survey evidence and link it to the digital traces that we know are powerful sources of tracking people's lives and making better sense of what's going on in real life. We did even more than surveys. We even interviewed a smaller group of people before and after they followed the bots to go even deeper, to start to probe the gap between social media and real life. And that really turned out to be the most revelatory of all our methods, because I became convinced that the kind of yawning gap between social media and reality is actually one of the key drivers of polarization today.
So what did you find? I mean, you refer to the fact that people's online and offline behaviors are actually quite different oftentimes. You refer to this one individual, I forget his name, who you said who was just the politest person you could come across. And, you looked at his feeds and they were, I guess, vile would be an understatement based on what you wrote. So what's going on here? Like, what's this, what's the relationship between people's online lives and their offline lives?
Right. Well, I think this is where we get into that deep human motivation for all this. I think like so many people think that, we are simple slaves to technology, right? That social media is almost like a hypodermic needle that can inject misinformation into us and compel us to act in different ways and so on and so forth. We know from decades of research on political communication that most technological outreach doesn't have a strong effect on people. It tends to have indirect effects. It might, start to shape what we talk about, but not necessarily what we think. And in the case of social media, there's something different going on too, right? It's not just that we, have a broader exposure to different types of information, or that we can selectively expose ourselves to one type of, information over another. But really more fundamentally, I think that it helps us to do something which is distinctly human. One of the things that makes us really unique in the animal kingdom is simply that we care so much what other people think about us. Each day, we all wake up, and I like to say, we experiment on our identities. I put on a different, self each day, and I look for clues in my environment about, which one is resonating with other people. If I am, a funny professor one day, and that seems to be working for me, great. But maybe I learn I'm not as funny as I think I am, and then I pull back on the humor and adjust and adjust and adjust. And we see this if we look in young children. You can see them experimenting with their identities constantly. Certainly teenagers, and yes, even us older folks, I think still do it, even if it becomes more subconscious. We're constantly trying to find social status. We're trying to find clues of how our behavior is generating respect from others. That's really what I think is uniquely human. And so if you think about social media, it's really fundamentally changing that process. So, before social media, if you and I were meeting in person, we would, quickly be able to read each other's, body movements, connect with each other's eyes, gesticulate, all these kind of hidden clues that we are hardwired to read. And, importantly, you could quickly evaluate whether my, presentation of self is reasonable, right? So, meeting me in person, you'd see that, I'm never going to be a professional basketball player, right? But online, I could pretend to be a professional basketball player, or whoever, right? It could be virtually anyone. And that's the point. We have a much broader palette of identities to experiment with. And that's really fundamentally changing the way we create our identities. I think not all of us I hope we'll get into some of the distinctions between these folks like this guy I call Ray in the book, who you mentioned earlier, who has such a different motivation than many other social media users. But at some level, our online behavior is a reflection of this human quest for status. And again, the technology is not only changing how we can experiment with our identities, but also how we monitor what other people think of us. So we have, powerful new technology, follower counts, like counts, and so on, a whole new vernacular, getting ratioed on Twitter, that are all meant to describe how well we're doing. And again, if you look to young people, you can see evidence for this all over the place. How much the number of likes their Instagram post gets, for example, determines their self-esteem and their confidence, right? We have these digital signals that we're using quite tragically, I think, to understand the world around us and to understand what people think of us.
So what you're implying is that we lose the clues or norms that we might have in a traditional face-to-face interaction. And so the set of possible behaviors that we exhibit in this sort of faceless way becomes much larger potentially. And we can use those to experiment in ways that give us more status.
That's right. That's right. And, earlier you were saying, people are taking refuge on social media. So let's maybe get into one of the cases in the book. This guy, Ray, that I was just mentioning and you alluded to earlier, really interesting character. So we start talking to this guy and, super polite, very deferential. He's a moderate conservative guy, he tells us, but he says he never talks about politics. He says, he always likes to keep things civil. He talks about growing up in New York and how he had friends from all sorts of different races and how, therefore, he's not racist, this, that, and the other. And so we go then to link this data that we had collected from that interview to the data we scraped from Twitter. And, this guy was turning from Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde every single night. So from what we could tell, he was spending hours every night meticulously photoshopping memes, the most vile memes possible, depicting Democratic leaders like Nancy Pelosi or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the most, reprehensible ways. And, again and again and again. And so the question immediately arises, how can someone be so different online and off? And when we began to probe deeper into this case, we could use demographic data collected from our survey firm, link it to data from Zillow, and really start to try to see, who this guy was. We discovered, okay, he's a moderate conservative guy, or self-described moderate, even though he apparently had stronger views, right? But, he's working in a liberal city. He works in a liberal profession. And, despite saying that the only types of people who like to argue about politics live in their mom's basement, this guy was a 55-year-old man who was living with his mother. So really what struck me most about this case is how this guy, Ray, was in dire need of some kind of social status. He just wasn't getting any kind of meaningful connection in his day-to-day life. And, earlier when I was saying we experiment on our identities, well, this is a perfect example. So one of the neat things with these data is we can go back in time and trace the evolution of people as they use social media more and more. And what we find is the more extreme Ray got in his criticism of Democrats, sure enough, the more likes he gets, the more follows he gets. He has a pretty modest number of Twitter followers, but for him, that's like a vital source of recognition and status, and maybe most importantly, belonging in a life where he just doesn't have that many meaningful connections. So however terrible for the rest of us, social media has allowed people like Ray to achieve a kind of micro celebrity. And that kind of status seeking, I think, explains a lot of extremism online today, not just on the right, but also on the left too.
So there's a couple of things I'm taking away from this. One is that the reward system is warped towards getting engagement. This guy doesn't have a life, so recommendation should be, Ray, get a life. Do other things, but he doesn't have a life. Social media is rewarding him for this vile, inflammatory content. Social media is sort of playing its role in this process as well, isn't it? It's sort of amplifying people like this.
Yeah, the incentive structures are all messed up right now. You're right. I like to say, I don't like to say, but it's true, that the easiest way to get a bunch of new followers on social media is to say something extreme about politics. There's a whole cadre of extremists out there just, looking for any kernel to like or any post to latch on to or attack, if they're working across boundaries. The interesting thing, though, is this dynamic, this concern about status. It not only explains, I think, how extremists become compelled to engage in extreme behavior, but also why so many more people disengage from social media. So, a lot of people, when I tell them this story, they say, okay, well, are you just saying that everybody is a status seeking extremist? Because I don't care. I have a happy life. I don't need to spend hours every night photoshopping, pictures of my political enemies. And I think that's exactly right. He's the outlier. Far more common in our research is a more moderate person for whom social media, especially engaging in political discussions on social media, is a total liability. So another case from the book is a woman I call Sarah to protect her confidentiality. And Sarah's a really interesting case. She's from New York. She's half Jewish, half Puerto Rican. But her dad is a cop, and so she has somewhat moderate conservative views. At the same time, she went to a Ivy League college. Most of her friends are liberal. She even reads the New York Times and the New Yorker, even if she doesn't agree with it all the time. And so she's kind of the exact type of person who has pretty nuanced views. And I think, and especially in talking to her for a long time, think is really well positioned to kind of, provide a thoughtful, productive perspective on things like race and policing. Again, because, she has some minority heritage, but her father is a police officer. She really, I think, in a lot of ways sees both sides really effectively from what I learned talking to her. But, you'll never hear her talk about any of this on social media. And the reason why is pretty obvious as soon as you start to talk to her. So one of the first questions we asked everybody is like, tell us something interesting that happened on social media recently, just to kind of get to know people. And the very first thing she said is, well, I haven't been on social media very much lately. And we said, why? She said, well, a few weeks ago, I was up late on Twitter and I was, scrolling through my feed, and a post comes up from the National Rifle Association, the organization that advocates for gun ownership in the U.S. And it just said something innocuous in the landscape of America's debate about guns. Something like, it's every American's right to own a gun, something like this. And she says a lot of liberal commentators were piling on this message and, criticizing it in pretty extreme ways. And she thought someone should say something in support of it. And so she just posted something like, my husband's a responsible gun owner. He owns a handgun. He's got a license. He practices at the range, and that's his right. Pretty innocuous. She says that within minutes, some more liberal, extreme Twitter users had examined her Twitter profile, determined that she had children, and posted, "We hope your kids find your gun and shoot you." And people like Sarah are not naive enough to have, to know that, people make threats online all the time. In fact, the Pew Research Center recently found that the number one reason people are harassed online is for expressing their political views. But for her, it was her kids, right? She's got a great life. She's got a happy family. She's got, a wonderful career. Engaging in political discussion online is all risk and no reward. And so what does she do? She disengages. And the real problem is that most moderates are doing this. So at the same time that social media has incentivized the kind of status-seeking extremism from the guy named Ray that we were talking about earlier, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character, it's disincentivizing the kind of moderation that someone like Sarah could contribute to important conversations like policing in the United States.
Yeah, I was really struck by that story. I had a somewhat unpleasant experience. A couple of years ago, I was walking around Washington Square Park, and there was a defund the police rally going on, and there was a 25-year-old basically yelling at this cop, and every second word was an expletive. And so I just said, hey, you might have better luck if you use English. And before I knew it, there were 5 people ready to beat me up, and I just got out of there as soon as I could. So that story's resonated with me, this real lack of any kind of tolerance for any other view. So other than status, is this sort of creating some kind of a cult, where people feel like there's bonding going on with other people who are as extreme as themselves? Is this what people feel like, they're actually bonding with other people via social media?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't study the January 6th insurrection, but I can speculate that some of that type of bonding brought those types of people together, because I saw it so much in extremist communities. but not only on the right, again, among the left too. You imagine yourself as an outcast, so, the earlier story was about a conservative living in a liberal city, but, another character in the book is a liberal living in bright red Alabama, and for these type of people, they're losing social connections day to day. So, this kid in Alabama, 19-year-old Democrat, works in a hospital, he's telling us, look, I can't even get through a football game with my family without politics coming up. And then everybody yells at each other and leaves, Thanksgiving dinner's short. He's like, my friends from high school, I think, even people I used to think are cool voted for Trump, and now I can't talk to them, right? And so it's just totally isolated. And so for these types of people, we all need that connection. We all need that kind of status. And what's really, really dangerous about the way that social media distorts reality is that we can come to understand these types of connections as really meaningful when they're not. So for example, we did a lot of analysis of the followers of people like Ray, the Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde character, and discovered, a lot of his followers are bots or other kinds of troll accounts. These are not, people who are going to, like, let's say, have him over to dinner or bail him out of jail or something like that, right? These are pretty meaningless connections. But, Ray misunderstands these people as a real social signal. It's a kind of sonar when you're out in the dark, trying to figure out what's, again, we're pinging out these identities and looking for any kind of evidence of what's working. By the way, we're bad at this offline too, right? We tend to misread social situations even in real life. So it makes sense we'd be bad at it online. But, online, this process of misperception has just gone into hyperdrive. So extremists can come to understand that their views are in fact quite normal. So one of the most powerful statistics I encountered in this research was a study done by, again, Pew, the Pew Research Center. And they discovered that about 6% of Twitter users in the United States generate about 76% of all tweets about politics. Now, I pulled that data and started to probe into it a little deeper and discovered that 6% of people is among the tiny part of the population that has extreme views either on the left or the right, almost all of them. And so what happens is we have this tiny group of extreme people who generate most of the content. And so if you're an extremist, you might say, well, my views aren't crazy. This is what everybody online thinks too. And conversely, and maybe more importantly, if you are a moderate or even just, someone who doesn't care much about politics, and you go online and stumble into a political conversation by accident, because I think actually most people try to avoid politics, you are very likely to encounter an extremist from the other side instead of a moderate. And even worse, you may confuse that extremist as a moderate and come to understand that the entire other side is crazy. And this can leave you feeling hopeless and apathetic. And this phenomenon, that we like to call false polarization, that people are really not as polarized as we often think they are, used to be driven by the media, right? It started with cable news probably, but social media has sent false polarization into hyperdrive.
It's ironic that Ray might be bonding with bots.
Yeah, it's true.
And thinks he's bonding with people, but they're bots. So you talk about how social media sort of normalizes extremism, but you also talk about the fact that it makes the other side appear more different than they actually are. Just say more about that, because I found that sort of interesting as well.
Yeah, so this is why I called the book Breaking the Social Media Prism, because I like this analogy of the prism, right? We talked about why echo chambers probably aren't the right way to think about things.
So just on that, sorry to interrupt. I should have actually asked you this. So why did you use the notion of a prism here? I was curious when I read the book, why prism? So say more about that.
I thought we needed a new analogy. We were earlier talking about echo chambers, and, we talked about how taking people out of their echo chambers doesn't seem to work. Another thing we discovered in this research is that most people actually aren't in echo chambers. That blew my mind. But, recent study out of Oxford suggests that less than 7% of people are in strong echo chambers. and maybe even as few as 3%. So the echo chamber idea, it's a seductive idea, but there's not a lot of evidence for it at all. And again, as I did the research for this book, and particularly as we compared people's online behavior to their offline behavior, we really started to discover that people were projecting a version of themselves that could be vastly different, right? We have these extremists who are very calm and polite in their everyday life. And then we have moderates who won't engage in political discussion at all on social media because it just, it costs them too much. It's too risky. And the effect for all of us is like a prism. Social media, we might want it to be a giant mirror that we can hold up to society and try to understand our place in it. But really, it's more like a prism that refracts and fuels or amplifies the more extreme parts of the ideological continuum and makes the moderates seem, all but invisible.
Referred to this guy called Derek Hunter. By the way, are these all pseudonyms?
Yes,
that I also thought was kind of, his views were also kind of interesting, which is that it's just too risky to say anything about politics. And I feel the same way myself, by the way. It's just, and especially these days, you have to be incredibly careful about what you say, because the cost of error is extremely high. And so I think moderates recognize that, and then that leads to them just sort of muting themselves.
And, importantly, that instinct to kind of, censor ourselves, it doesn't just come from pissing off the other side, right? It also comes from pissing off our side. In fact, some of the most angry encounters we observed in the millions of social media posts we analyzed, in the course of our research, were among people on the same side. So people who criticize Trump get attacked by, the MAGA people, or like you were saying, your experience around defund the police. Same thing. People who question defund the police were substantially attacked online. So, that's part of the problem. We're so focused on the between party dynamics, but intra-party polarization, polarization within parties, it's clear as day right now that that's the problem for the Democratic Party, right? If you want to get anything done, you gotta, get your own house in order. And I won't be surprised if we see that further down the line in the next administration, if the next administration is Republican, because, this type of extreme polarization starts to create ripples within the parties as well.
I was actually struck by that description of Derek. I think it was Derek, but maybe someone else, where they monitor their followers really closely as well and tend to really excoriate people for betraying the party, right? For not doing the party line.
Or when they get unfollowed. So for someone, imagine you're someone like this guy, Ray, who depends so badly on, on social media status for this sense of, meaning and importance. Every single person who unfollows you is, it's like a personal attack, and these people use these various tools that help you track who unfollows you or who unfriends you. And then they attack those people sometimes even in more extreme ways, which really resembles the kind of cult-like dynamics that we were talking about earlier.
So, Chris, this is all pretty depressing at this point. Let's.
I get that a lot.
Let's see if we can pick this up a little bit.
Sure.
And, maybe look for rays of hope here. So, should we just delete our Facebook accounts and go back to good old physical world? Or are we just in this too deeply at this point?
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest. I've contemplated getting off social media. I think a lot of people have. A lot of people are asking themselves, what value does this add to my life? There's so much negativity on social media. Sure, I like cute cats, but, I could get pictures of cute cats elsewhere, right? Here's the problem. A few different problems. First of all, if we look towards younger generations are online more than ever, especially people under 18 right now, just almost constantly online. And social media has become so inextricably linked to just about everything we do that pulling out of it doesn't just mean, we can all make our own individual decisions, right? If you pull out of Facebook, then, we have stories in the book of people whose friends then get upset that they didn't like their posts or they They, they were then missing out on too much. They had fear of missing out because they got off social media, right? It's stuck. It's part of it's unfortunately, I think, part of the DNA of our, or the fabric of our society right now. Secondly, and this is maybe the more important point, we can't seem to, get ourselves to connect outside of social media. So, we've long known that Democrats and Republicans have started to sort themselves into different zip codes. They were living in different areas, they're working in different professions. But a recent study out of Harvard, which looked at very granular data from the U.S. voter file, which, enables us to examine, tens of millions of people, suggests that most Democrats and Republicans are now living in areas of the country where they may seldom, if ever, meet someone from the other party in their everyday lives. And certainly COVID has made this worse, right? We're all inside more, and to the extent that that may have changed social norms around hanging out with new people or reaching out to new people, right? The internet is becoming, the place where, maybe the only place where we can have conversations across divides. So, there's all these reasons why, we're really stuck and depend on social media. So, I read about a few different movements to delete accounts. You may remember a few years back, delete Facebook started trending on Twitter, and famous people like Elon Musk and Will Ferrell were saying, they're deleting their Facebook accounts. And it was interesting. I looked at some Google search data to try to track this. And, the number of people, sure enough, searching how to delete Facebook spiked, right after this movement. But then the really interesting thing, and the somewhat depressing thing, is 1 week later, how to undelete Facebook was one of the top Google searchers, right? And so there's other examples of this. People who take social media breaks tend to come back. And they tend to come back because they realize that, society just really can't function without it. So even though a lot of us, I think, would love to just get back to doing things in person, it just doesn't seem like that's a viable solution. And even worse, if thoughtful people like you disengage from social media, then this prism-like effect only gets worse, right? Then these extremists we've been talking about only occupy more real estate. And then, the more moderate voices will become, even less prominent. So really, like it or not, I think social media is here to stay. And I think, it's not just we can't just disengage even to make it better. We really have to proactively try to change it, both from the top down and the bottom up.
Yeah, I for sure, I think I could, delete my Facebook account and function okay. I mean, I still use it, sporadically, but kids are really kind of in this, pretty much all the way, right? You've got kids, right? So how old are your kids?
All under 10. And, that I'm hoping beyond hope to keep them off social media till at least 14 or 16. But, I'm watching friends with older kids, and I see them, getting smartphones, 8, 9 years old. And before you know it, it's Instagram, YouTube, it's a terrifying prospect that people who, can't yet process the many terrible things we see online may be socialized into this system, really, and start to internalize their sense of self-worth from the types of reactions they're getting online. So we're holding out as long as we can, but we know there's going to come a point where every other kid is on, and we're going to be, our kids are going to be missing out. So I do worry about this.
I asked one of my previous guests and colleague Adam Alter the same question. He's got kids, and I asked him and what this reminds me. So one of the takeaways from Adam's session was this, hour-long interview by a New York Times journalist called Nick Bilton. He was talking to Steve Jobs, and at the end of it, asked him, this iPad, what do your kids think about it? He said, we don't let them use it. It's too dangerous. So it's interesting that the people who are most savvy about technology are also most aware of its negative sides.
I think you're right about that, but I also think we need to be worried about letting tech leaders correct the course. So, we have, a steady stream of polemics from ex-Facebookers, ex-Googlers saying, oh, we built this system, we now regret it, and we alone can fix it, right? Because we are the ones that understand how it works. And most of these polemics, I think, are filled with a lot of, mistruths or half-truths. So we've already talked about the echo chamber and why that might not be the solution that so many people think it is. But there's so many other issues that are out there in the public conversation that really haven't been scrutinized. So, let's take misinformation, huge problem, really concerning when we see the scale at which misinformation can spread, when we see so many people, particularly with COVID. But one thing that's really not yet been analyzed enough, I think, is whether the spread of misinformation actually means that people are changing their behaviors. So, first of all, the spread of misinformation is often exaggerated. So, for example, a lot of people think that misinformation won Trump the 2016 election, right? But studies suggest that the average American probably saw and remembered one piece of fake news during that whole time. Would one piece of fake news really sway your vote? We know that no political ads really seem to work. We even know that no political campaign seemed to work. So why would one post change what you think, right? So we had an opportunity to link some data that we had collected to exposures to Russian troll accounts. So we were able to survey people before and after they did or did not have interactions with Russian troll accounts, and discovered that the people who were interacting with trolls didn't seem to change their views. In fact, trolls seem to target only that tiny group of people who are already in echo chambers, whose views are already so extreme that their views didn't really move. And so this idea that, misinformation and, that platforms could they do a better job stamping out misinformation? Of course. Should they hire more people? Of course.
Could this not have been happening under the radar? I'm reminded of this Kozinski paper that demonstrated that you could really kind of influence people's moods quite effectively. So couldn't this have been happening at a subliminal level where people were influenced? To use your words, they sort of decided they had to toe the party line, even though their views might have been more nuanced.
The available evidence, I think, suggests the answer is no. So, studies of micro-targeting suggest that in general elections, micro-targeting either has no effect or possibly even a negative effect. So if you accidentally target a Biden voter with a Trump ad, that you may actually make that voter more likely to vote for Biden. The one area where we have seen micro-targeting move some behavior is with primary elections. So if you are trying to create a name for someone who doesn't have a lot of name recognition yet, it seems that micro-targeting around a candidate's name can make people more likely to recognize that name, not to vote for them, but to recognize them. So that is a kind of subliminal effect. But, even consumer behavior, I think so many of us have had this experience where we saw a Facebook ad and then we suddenly find ourselves buying shoes we didn't need or something like that, right? And then we quickly go to, oh, wow, social media can control our very, deepest, innermost psychology and behavior and wants and needs and desires. But I know, I think you had Sinan Aral on the podcast recently, whose new book, The Hype Machine, reports on a meta-analysis of consumer behavior. And what that meta-analysis suggests is micro-targeting around advertising doesn't seem to work very often at all, if at all. So really, the idea that who's giving us this narrative that social media has this all-powerful command over human psychology, it's the platforms themselves, right? They actually like this narrative because it helps them sell ads that probably aren't working, according to research out of Kellogg. And many other leading places looking at dozens of studies. So, it's crazy, because we keep hearing echo chambers, misinformation, algorithms that radicalize us. There's not a lot of support for any of these ideas. And so my concern is if we look towards what's happening in government right now, we're trying to regulate social media. And if we focus on things like misinformation, which there should be some regulation in these areas. But if we think that taking people out of echo chambers, tamping down on misinformation and tweaking the algorithms that social media works is going to fix all our problems, I'm worried we're going to be really disappointed.
So, by the way, you referred to Sinan, and one of the things that I was struck by in what he said was the fact that the social network has actually been created by Facebook. I mean, it didn't exist out there. Initially, I remember when I first joined Facebook, people would say, oh, let me see if my friend from high school is on Facebook. So there was this sort of organic search for people happening. But then didn't algos kind of take over and say, okay, now we've got enough data about preferences and tendencies, and now we're going to start connecting people. If you're connected to this person and this person connected to that person, now we're going to start closing these triangles. So didn't they actually, by virtue of creating these dense networks, create this sort of amplification and echo chamber as well?
Yeah, I think, one of the great parts about Sinan's book is, the point that, by design, social media is about spreading ideas as far and wide as possible, right? But the interesting thought experiment, I think, is worth thinking about.
But first, it's about creating the network through which you're going to send stuff, is what I'm saying.
Sure.
Right?
But I guess what I would say is it's a network, but is it the network? It's like, I don't know about your Facebook feed, but mine is filled with posts from people I barely know from high school, or, people I, spent a day with, 6 years ago. These are not the type of people who I'm like leaning on, for a loan, or who I'm going to, have over to dinner. These are kind of weird, superficial, relatively random connections that are the product of, as you say, an algorithm that's analyzing my social network and trying to find the friends of my friends who I'm not friends with and inferring who I should be friends with, right? Does that enable deeper connections? Sure. I mean, not deeper, but broader connections and denser connections in a way. Yeah. But let's think about the online versus offline again. For my money, these networks aren't really changing the more critical social connections that determine our worth. Another idea out there, really popular right now, is that algorithms are radicalizing people. And I don't think we have enough data yet to know if that's true. But so far, most of the evidence in favor, as far as I can see, comes from one New York Times report about one individual. A really compelling article written by the Times columnist Kevin Roose, who does a great job, covering technology. And the story is that this young man watched YouTube and then, was increasingly suggested to see other YouTube videos that, sent him down this kind of proverbial rabbit hole of extremism, where he was shown, increasingly, violent and extreme stuff, to the point where, the story says he bought a gun to defend himself because he was getting harassed online and all this stuff. And so an interesting group of researchers at Microsoft and Penn and a few other, leading institutions said, okay, well, let's actually look at some data here. Let's look at, I think it was about 176 million YouTube viewing sessions over 4 or 5 years. And let's see how many people go down this pathway, because they can see, what sequence people viewed information in, especially with web browsing data. And what they find is almost no one goes down that rabbit hole. We still can't know that algorithms don't create subtle shifts or the kind of subconscious shifts that you were alluding to earlier. I think they do have some effect. But if people were thinking that it's all the algorithm, and that if only, Facebook would just make one change, all this would go away, I think we're going to be disappointed, because, we all play a role in this. In some ways, I've come to think that social media is not driving polarization, but rather allowing us to see the full breadth of polarization, because we're connected to so many more people. So we can see all these crazy folks who we'd never meet in real life. And then they start to, unfortunately, have this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where it starts to shape our own social opinions. So yeah, it does. I mean, it's about the relationship between online and off, right? It's not that social media platforms have no role in this. They have there's a lot of blame to go around. And we certainly need, more oversight of platforms. I think we certainly need more innovation in platforms. That's something I'm particularly optimistic about. But, again, fixing this problem is unfortunately not just on the platforms. It's on all of us, I think.
By the way, I went to polarization.com, the website you've created to score people on their political views, because I was curious about where I would fall on the political spectrum. So it asked for access to my Twitter account, and after some grinding, told me I resembled two US congresspeople, Stephen Lynch from Massachusetts and another individual I'm too embarrassed to name because of how far left they are. And it gave me a score of 4.2, by the way. So what does that mean?
Bad, yeah.
So 4.2 is not bad?
Well, so you're talking about this tool that allows people to put in their Twitter data, and what the tool does is it predicts your political ideology based upon the text in your tweets. So a 4.2 is somewhere left of center. Yeah.
That's interesting that I would be left of center, because I view most people I know well to be more left than I am. So I wondered where I stood relative to center, wherever that is.
But remember, earlier you were telling me you don't talk about politics on social media, right?
I try to minimize it.
You try not to.
I'm just scared. I mean, to be quite honest.
I think we all are. So I think that's partly why you're getting that score. And there's other tools on polarizationlab.com which people can use freely to measure the strength of their echo chamber. So if you tried the echo chamber tool, you might find that you see a lot more left bias there, because folks are your friends, as you say, are mostly liberal.
So what kind of innovation do we need, or regulation, or a combination of the two, right? I've written a lot about 230. I've sort of railed against, social media platforms and our inaction here. What do you propose as a solution? Because I think, your view is, these platforms have problems. They made some poor governance choices, perhaps. But but I think one of the things you also say is that they've lost their sense of purpose, right? What's Facebook's mission?
Exactly,
to bring people together? Well, that happened a while ago, right? That was done already. It seems like their only mission is to make more money,
right?
And so one of the things you propose is sort of more top-down designed social media platforms. So how do we make that happen?
Yeah, so if we look at the reason why platforms were created, let's look at the four largest platforms right now are Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. Facebook famously created to help college undergraduates rate each other's physical attractiveness. Instagram was originally called Bourbon, as in the drink, because it was designed to facilitate alcohol-based gatherings. YouTube was created to allow friends to share humorous videos. And TikTok, I don't even know, but it was nothing good, right? The point is,
we'll never know.
We'll never know, right? The point is that, these platforms don't really have a purpose, right? They were designed to serve the kind of niche or even sophomoric needs of tiny parts of the internet. And now in the space of less than a decade, sometimes even less, they've suddenly morphed into the most vital and critical forum for discussing major problems like COVID-19, rising inflation, climate change. As you said, like TikTok's now at the center of the Russia-Ukraine controversy, right? And yet it's not in their DNA, right? They were never designed to serve this purpose. And my biggest complaint about the current situation is that we've accepted this current paradigm as a given. We've been saying, okay, well, given that Facebook is bad, we don't like what it's doing. Let's try to tweak this over here and, edit this over here, and then we'll maybe get things back on course. But the bigger question is, what is the course? What are we working towards? And we can define that in a lot of different ways. And I think once we give platforms a sense of purpose, we can design for it. But to design for it, we also need research. And this is where, there's so much wild speculation right now, right? It's the echo chamber, it's the algorithms, it's the misinformation, it's the like button, it's this, that, and the other. We don't know because we don't have basic science on social media. The vast majority of the research is on existing platforms. And the vast majority of the research is on either Twitter or Reddit, because those are the two platforms that really allow researchers to get much data. And so, we've only been able to do largely observational analyses where we try to detect trends and then work backwards towards causal explanations. What we need, and I think, and what we ultimately decided to build in the Polarization Lab, is a new platform for scientific research on social media. And here's the idea. Basically, we create a blank template of a social media platform, and then we turn on and off different features, things like a like button or things like a follower count, or we could control the algorithm to experiment with different algorithms and see how different, nudges might shape how people behave. And then we pay people to use it. We say, hey, we'd like to pay you to help, test a new social media platform for a week. And so, we've now done a number of studies on this platform, but the one that I read about in the book, and I think is most relevant to our conversation today, we created this platform. We gave it a somewhat lame name. We called it Discuss It. We didn't want to give away the purpose of the platform, which was to bring Republicans and Democrats together to have, a relatively brief, less than an hour long chat about either gun control or immigration. So we recruited a bunch of people, almost 1,500 people, and we said, hey, here's an invite code if you're in the studies treatment condition. And when they put that invite code into our platform, it, unbeknownst to the study participant, paired them with a member of the other party to talk about one of these two issues, gun control or immigration. And, we didn't pay them to try to find compromise. We didn't encourage them to try to find compromise. We didn't do anything except experiment with one fundamental feature of social media. And this one might surprise some people. We wanted to study anonymity. Now, anonymity gets a really bad rap for good reasons. Earlier we were talking about this guy, Ray, who hides behind anonymity to say some of the most vile stuff, I've ever seen on the internet. On the other hand, anonymity may also help us try to get past our human tendency to put our identities before our ideas. So as soon as we see the identity of the people that we are discussing something with, if I'm a Democrat and I'm talking to a Republican, I may immediately throw up cognitive defenses to deflect any and all arguments before I even really consider them. And so anonymity has this underappreciated feature, which is that it might allow us to consider ideas outside the context of this all too human bias, but also outside the context of peer pressure. So, earlier we were talking about defund the police, and you can imagine, talking about defund the police on Twitter, a really, charged environment where you can quickly be penalized by your side if you're a Democrat, if you have concerns about that. But if you're talking anonymously, why not? You could share whatever you want. Anonymous, asynchronous conversation might also give us some time to kind of contemplate and think, go through our day and say, maybe they had a point about this, that, or the other. So, we wanted to know, is anonymity going to drive more incivility like that guy, Ray? Or is it going to make people open up and have productive conversations? And so people for 1 week or so engaged in this kind of conversation, typically lasted less than an hour. And sure enough, at the end of the week, people who used the app to engage in an anonymous conversation exhibited substantially less polarized attitudes. And this effect was particularly strong for Republicans. And this is something I find particularly interesting. Republicans who talk to Democrats in this anonymous fashion depolarized at about 4 times the rate of Democrats. So Democrats depolarized too, but Republicans polarize much more, suggesting perhaps that the power of the identity on the Republican side is really preventing those people from humanizing the other side, connecting with the other side, or feeling safe to voice criticisms of their own side. Like maybe you doubt that there was widespread voter fraud. Like you're not going to announce that on Twitter, but if you're in this anonymous format, maybe it gives you the space and the freedom to explore that idea.
That's very interesting that you talk about anonymity. I'm also wondering the extent to which the reward system would influence that dialogue. It seemed to me that in Discuss It, the reward system was sort of relatively neutral. But on the other hand, you refer to platforms like Stack Overflow, where the reward system is geared towards encouraging people to provide answers that'll be useful to the widest range of people who come to that platform. And I use Stack Overflow all the time. If I am writing some Python code, I'll go there and sure enough, there's an answer and it sort of rewards people. sort of to come back to sort of the top-down design of a social media platform, right? It seems to me that the reward structure would really drive the conversation, right? If your status is built not on bonding but on bipartisan appeal, then it should drive your behavior in that direction, shouldn't it?
Yeah. And that's exactly where we took these findings. So, earlier we were talking about engagement-based rankings. So this is where, our newsfeed algorithms tend to promote those posts that get a lot of engagement, like shares, but especially comments. And so, let's think about what's the easiest way to get engagement. It's to say something crazy, right? That's going to appeal to that small group of people that is the most active on social media, but also has the most extreme views on your side. But it's also going to provoke tons of comments from the other side. And so what you're going to get is, this perverse incentive structure for people to say the most extreme thing possible in order to generate attention and in order to move up in people's news feeds. So now imagine that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, whatever, as they're recommending content to us or determining the order in which we see it. What if they ranked the content that was liked by people from both sides? So boost the content that gets likes from both Republicans and Democrats instead of encouraging people to preach to the choir, which is what they're currently doing. And, this is a reform that could be put in place, in weeks. We know platforms track this kind of stuff. And we know that it's, pretty trivial to build an algorithm that could do this. I think the $1 million question is, will the platforms recognize not only a moral incentive to do that, but also an economic incentive to do that? And that's where things get messy. I won't lie, the graveyard of social media platforms is very well populated right now, especially the most romantic, idealized versions, where it's just, it'll be a place where people come together and there's happy feelings, right? Those don't seem to work out. So I think we need to convince platforms that this is in their interest. And there's some initial inklings that this might also be in their interest. I am very skeptical of anything that comes out of Facebook's public relations right now. But one of the ways that Facebook has reacted to the Facebook files and other recent revelations, this seemingly steady stream of revelations coming out of Facebook is, look, we are, getting rid of polarization is actually also in our interest, because when Coca-Cola runs an ad next to someone calling someone else Adolf Hitler, like Coca-Cola calls us and says, we don't want our ad running next to this crap, Coca-Cola would much rather have their ad running next to something that appeals across political divides, because then they get to get, eyeballs from both Republicans and Democrats, right? And it doesn't even have to be Republicans and Democrats. I mean, it could be men and women, old people and young people, rural people and city people, whatever it is, whatever kind of divide we want to cross. Technology could optimize for that. Instead of, again, encouraging this kind of incivility. And I think, where we'll really see where things go, right now, Facebook is hemorrhaging users, not just in the United States, but now also internationally, which was unthinkable, I think, 2 years ago. If you told me 3 years ago that TikTok was going to leapfrog Google, Microsoft, and Facebook to become the top domain this year, I would say you're crazy. But it happened. And, we know that from leaked conversations that Mark Zuckerberg's also sensing, struggling to compete with TikTok. So the question is this is a fluid market. People are jumping around to different platforms. People get easily, disappointed with platforms. Very few people, I think, go to Facebook and, wake up every morning and say, I just love Facebook. I'd love to just spend a lot of time on Facebook. It's like we tolerate it, but that doesn't mean we like it. And that gives me some hope that market forces could provide maybe not a platform that, everyone's going to use. So I don't think tomorrow we're going to wake up and Facebook's going to do a 180 and suddenly implement these types of reforms I'm talking about. But I do think smaller platforms on the model of a site like Stack Overflow could reward this kind of bonding behavior. And in certain sectors, it might even be a career credential, just like, a software developer might get a job because of their reputation on Stack Overflow. Imagine a site for political discussion that rewards people who provide answers to questions that are convincing to lots of different types of people. that person's going to be pretty employable in Washington right now. And not just Washington, but the many, many sectors that are being stalled by polarization right now. So, is it going to change everything overnight? Of course not. But thinking about changing the incentive structure and thinking about how the incentive structure links to basic human behavior around, status and identity, I think is really vital.
Thanks for that summary, Chris, and very well put, including this need for some experimentation related to incentives, status, etc., and the need for more science required to converge towards better platforms, which is also quite encouraging relative to the pessimistic tone that we started with. So before we wrap up, there's all this talk about the metaverse these days. I was on a podcast as a guest last week where I made a prediction, which is usually a bad idea, that in the future we will deal with the world increasingly through our avatars, which we shape through trial and error until we find the exterior that works best for us. Have you thought about the implications of these digital identities for things like polarization? What kind of prism effect could these digital identities create?
Wow, it's a huge question. I think we're in the early hours of this moment. I think, first of all, I think you're right that our digital identities, will become more precious to us, and that the flexibility will become something we value. What's less clear to me is how this fits into the broader, political spectrum. I think it depends again on this reward structure. What is the point of the metaverse? Nobody's asking that question yet either, right? Is it to connect people to some kind of, vague techno idealist, cliche? Probably. I haven't, but is the metaverse supposed to make us sympathetic to refugees? Is it supposed to allow us to play tennis with friends across great geographical divides? What's the point? I guess my deepest concern is that there's still no motivating behavior. I think many of us are looking on curiously at the metaverse being like, wow, look at all these crazy folks with VR headsets. What are they doing all day? And maybe one day I'll find myself, with the VR headset on right along with them. But for now, I think a lot of people are asking, what value does it add to my life? But for these younger generations that are increasingly online and that will care deeply about these kinds of digital and apparently pay money for the avatars and to clothe or change the avatars, right? I think this indicates that is what's to come. I think the real challenge again will be to try to think about how avatars are really more broadly like games, video games in general are such an important part of life for younger people in particular. We need to try to harness that behavior. And there's some brilliant young scholars doing some of this research trying to gamify the types of status that I'm talking about here, to try to reward people who engage in that bonding behavior. But, how will it affect the types of political problems we have right now? I think that's not for me to say. I want to see the data. As you can tell, I'm a data guy. I want to see an experiment before I weigh in. So I'll have to leave it at that.
Fair enough. Well, Chris, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Really enjoyed it. Enjoyed your book, Breaking the Social Media Prism, which I highly recommend. Great reading. So thanks again for sharing your time and thoughts.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.